The Gift of the Probable Places by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. My mother says that everybody in the world has got some special gift. Some people have one kind and some have another. I got my skates and dictionary book last spring when I was 9. I've always had my freckles. My brother Carol's gift is being dumb. No matter what anybody says to him, he doesn't have to answer 'em. There was an old man in our town named Old Man Smith. Old Man Smith had a wonderful gift. It wasn't a Christmas gift like toys and games. It wasn't a birthday gift, all stockings and handkerchiefs. It was the gift of finding things. He called it the gift of the probable places. Most any time when you lost anything, he could find it for you. He didn't find it by floating a few tea leaves in a cup, or by trying to match cards, or by fooling with silly things like ghosts. He didn't even find it with his legs. He found it with his head. He found it by thinking very hard with his head. People came from miles around to borrow his head. He always charged everybody just the same, no matter what it was that they'd lost. $1 was what he charged. It was just as much trouble to him, he said, to think about a thimble that was lost as it was to think about an elephant that was lost. I never knew anybody who lost an elephant. When the postmaster's wife lost her diamond ring, she hunted more than 100 places for it. She was most distracted. She thought somebody had stolen it from her. She hunted it in all the newspapers. She hunted it in all the stores. She hunted it all up and down the village streets. She hunted it in the depot carriage. She hunted it in the hired girl's trunk. Miles and miles and miles she must have hunted it, with her hands and with her feet. But Old Man Smith found it for her without budging an inch from his wheelchair. Just with his head alone he found it. Just by asking her a question that made her mad he found it. The question that made her mad was about her baptismal name. Her baptismal name was Mehetabel Euphemia. "However in the world," said Old Man Smith, "did you ever get such a perfectly hideous name as Mehetabel Euphemia?" The postmaster's wife was madder than scat. She wrung her hands. She snapped her thumbs. She crackled her finger joints. Never, never, she said, had she been so insulted. Exactly what I thought," said Old Man Smith. "Now just when, if you can remember, was the last time that you felt you'd never been so insulted before?" "Insulted!" screamed the postmaster's wife. "Why, I haven't been so insulted as this since 2 weeks ago last Saturday, when I was out in my backyard under the mulberry tree dyeing my old white dress peach pink, and the druggist's wife came along and asked me if I didn't think I was just a little bit too old to be wearing peach pink." "Me? Too old? Me?" screamed the postmaster's wife. Said Old Man Smith. "Pink, you say? Pink? A little powdered cochineal, I suppose, and a bit of cream o' tartar, and more than a bit of alum. It's a pretty likely combination to make the fingers slippery. And a lady what crackles her finger joints so every time she's mad, and snaps her thumbs, and—" "Yes, under the mulberry tree is a very probable place. $1, please," said Old Man Smith. And when the grocer's nephew got suspended from college for sitting up too late at night and getting headaches, and came to spend a month with his uncle and couldn't find his green plaid overcoat when it was time to go home, he was perfectly positive that somebody had borrowed it from the store, or that he'd dropped it out of the delivery wagon working overtime, or that he'd left it at the high school social. But Old Man Smith found it for him just by glancing at his purple socks, and his plaid necktie, and his plush waistcoat. "Oh, yes, of course, it's perfectly possible," said Old Man Smith, "that you dropped it from the basket of a balloon on your way to a missionary meeting. But have you looked in the young widow Gayette's back hall, 'bout 3 pegs from the door, where the shadows are fairly private?" $1, please," said Old Man Smith. And when the old preacher lost the hymn book that George Washington had given his grandfather, everybody started to take up the floor of the church to see if it had fallen down through a crack in the pulpit. But Old Man Smith sent a boy running to beg him not to tear down the church, till they'd looked in the old lawyer's pantry, 'bout the second shelf between the ice chest and the cheese crock. Sunday evening after meeting was rather a lean time with old preachers, he said he'd always noticed, and old lawyers was noted for their fat larders, and there were certain things about cheese somehow that seemed to be soothin' to the memory. "Why, how perfectly extraordinary!" said everybody. $1, please," said Old Man Smith again. And when little Tommy Bent ran away to the city, his mother hunted all the hospitals for him, and made him drag the river, and wore a long black veil all the time, and howled. But Old Man Smith said, "Oh, shucks, it ain't at all probable, is it, that he was aimin' at hospitals or rivers when he went away? What's the use of worryin' over the things he weren't aimin' at, till you've investigated the things he was?" "Aimin' at!" sobbed Mrs. Bent. "Aimin' at! Who in the world could ever tell what any little boy was aimin' at?" "And there's something in that, too," said Old Man Smith. "What did he look like?" "Like his father," said Mrs. Bent. Plain, you mean?" said Old Man Smith. "He was only 9 years old," sobbed Mrs. Bent, "but he did love meetings so. No matter what they was about, he was always hunting for some new meetings to go to. He just seemed naturally to dote hisself on any crowd of people that was all facing the other way, looking at somebody else. He had a little cowlick at the back of his neck," sobbed Mrs. Bent. "It was a comical little cowlick. People used to laugh at it. He never liked to sit any place where there was anybody sitting behind him." "Now you're talking," said Old Man Smith. "Will he answer to the name of little Tommy Bent?" "He will not," said Mrs. Bent. "He's that stubborn. He's exactly like his father." Old Man Smith wrote an entirely new advertisement to put in the papers. It didn't say anything about rivers, or hospitals, or dead or alive. It just said, "Lost in the back seat of most any meeting, a very plain little boy, will not answer to the name of little Tommy Bent, stubborn like his father." "We'll put that in about being stubborn," said Old Man Smith, "because it sounds quaint and will interest people." "It won't interest Mr. Bent," sobbed Mrs. Bent, "and it seems awful cruel to make it so public about the child's being plain." Old Man Smith spoke coldly to her. "Would you rather lose him handsome," he said, "or find him plain?" Mrs. Bent seemed to think that she'd rather find him plain. She found him within 2 days. He was awful plain. His shoes were all worn out, and his stomach was flat. He was at a meeting of men who sell bicycles to China. The men were feeling pretty sick. They'd sent hundreds and hundreds of he bicycles to China, and the Chinamen couldn't ride 'em on account of their skirts. It was the smell of an apple in a man's pocket that made Tommy Bent follow the man to the meeting, and he answered to every name except Tommy Bent, so they knew it was he. "Mercy, what this experience has cost me!" sobbed Mrs. Bent. $1, please," said Old Man Smith. "It's a perfect miracle," said everybody. "It tain't neither," said Old Man Smith. "It's plain hoss sense. There's laws about finding things, same as there is about losing 'em. Things has got regular habits and haunts, same as folks, and folks has got regular haunts and habits, same as birds and beasts. It ain't the possible places that I'm arguing about. The world is full of 'em. But the probable places can be reckoned most any time on the fingers of one hand. That's the trouble with folks. They're always wearing themselves out on the possible places, and never getting round at all to the probable ones. Now it's perfectly possible, of course," said Old Man Smith, "that you might find a trout in a dustpan, or a hummin' bird in an aquarium, or meet a panther in your mother's parlor. But the chances are," said Old Man Smith, "that if you were really set out to organize a troutin' expedition, or a hummin' bird collection, or a panther hunt, you wouldn't look in the dustpan, or the aquarium, or your mother's parlor first. When you lose something that ain't got no probable place, then I sure am stumped," said Old Man Smith. But when Annie Halloway lost her mind, everybody in the village was stumped about it, and everything was all mixed up. It was Annie Halloway's mother, and Annie Halloway's father, and Annie Halloway's uncles and aunts and cousins and friends who did all the worrying about it, while Annie Halloway herself didn't seem to care at all, but just sat braiding things into her hair. Some people said it was a railroad accident that she lost her mind in. Some said it was because she'd studied too hard in Europe. Some said it was an earthquake. Everybody said something. Annie Halloway's father and mother were awful rich. They brought her home in a great big ship and gave her 12 new dresses and the front parlor and a brown piano, but she wouldn't stay in any of them. All she'd stay in was a little old blue silk dress she'd had before she went away. Carol and I got excused from school one day because we were afraid our heads might ache, and went to see what it was all about. It seemed to be about a great many things. But after we'd walked all around Annie Halloway twice and looked at her all we could and asked how old she was and found out that she was 19, we felt suddenly very glad about something. We felt suddenly very glad that if she really was obliged to lose anything out of her face, it was her mind that she lost, instead of her eyes, or her nose, or her red, red mouth, or her cunning little ears. She was so pretty. She seemed to like us very much, too. She asked us to come again. We said we would. We did. We went every Saturday afternoon. They let us take her to walk if we were careful. We didn't walk her in the village because her hair looked so funny. We walked her in the pleasant fields. We gathered flowers. We gathered ferns. We explored birds. We built little gurgling harbors in the corners of the brook. Sometimes we climbed hills and looked off. Annie Halloway seemed to like to climb hills and look off. It was the day we climbed the sumac hill that we got our idea. It was a nice day. Annie Halloway wore her blue dress and her blue scarf. Her hair hung down like 2 long loose black ropes across her shoulders. Blue larkspur was braided into her hair, and a little tin trumpet tied with blue ribbon, and a blue Japanese fan, and a blue lead pencil, and a blue silk stocking, and a blue-handled basket. She looked like a summer Christmas tree. It was pretty. There were lots of clouds in the sky. They seemed very near. It sort of puckered your nose. "Smell the clouds," said Annie Halloway. Somebody had cut down a tree that used to be there. It made a lonely hole in the edge of the hill in the sky. Through the lonely hole in the edge of the hill in the sky you could see miles and miles. Way down in the valley a bright light glinted. It was as though the whole sun was trying to bore a hole in a tiny bit of glass and couldn't do it. Annie Halloway stretched out her arms towards the glint and started for it. I looked at Carol. Carol looked at me. We knew where the glint was. It was Old Man Smith's house. Old Man Smith's house was built of teacups and broken tumblers and bits of plates. First of all, of course, it was built of clay or mud or something soft and loose like that, and while it was still soft he had stuck it all full of people's broken dishes, so that wherever you went most all day long the sun was trying to bore a hole in it and couldn't do it. It seemed to be the glint that Annie Halloway wanted. She thought it was something new to braid in her hair, I guess. She kept right on walking towards it with her arms stretched out. Carol kept right on looking at me. His mouth was all turned white. Sometimes when people talk to me I can't understand at all what they mean. But when Carol looks at me with his mouth all turned white, I always know just exactly what he means. It made my own mouth feel pretty white. "We shall be punished," I said. "We'll surely be punished if we do it." My brother Carol smiled. It was quite a white smile. He put out his hand. I took it. We ran down the hill after young Annie Halloway and led her to the glint. Old Man Smith was pretty surprised to see us. He was riding round the dooryard in his wheelchair. He rolled his chair to the gate to meet us. The chair squeaked a good deal, but even if he'd wanted to walk he couldn't. The reason why he couldn't is because he's dumb in his legs. "What in the world do you want?" he asked. I looked at Carol. Carol looked at me. He kicked me in the shins. My thoughts came very quickly. "We've brought you a young lady that's lost her mind," I said. "What can you do about it?" Something happened all at once that made our legs feel queer. What happened was that Old Man Smith didn't seem pleased at all about it. He snatched his long white beard in his hands. "Lost her mind," he said. "Her mind! Her mind! How darst you mock me?" he cried. "We daresn't at all," I explained, "on account of the bears. We've read all about the mocking bears in a book." He seemed to feel better. "You mean in the good book?" he said. "The Elijah bears, you mean?" "Well, it was quite a good book," I admitted, "though my father's got lots of books on tulips that have heap prettier covers." Said Old Man Smith. And all the time he was saying young Annie Halloway was knocking down his house. With a big chunk of rock she was chipping it off. It was a piece of blue china cup with the handle still on it that she chipped off first. When Old Man Smith saw it he screamed. "Woman, what are you doing?" he screamed. "Her name is young Annie Halloway," I explained. "Young Annie Halloway, come here!" screamed Old Man Smith. Young Annie Halloway came here. She was perfectly gentle about it. All her ways were gentle. She sat down on the ground at Old Man Smith's feet. She lifted her eyes to Old Man Smith's eyes. She looked holy. But all the time that she looked so holy she kept right on braiding the handle of the blue china cup into her hair. It cranked against the tin trumpet. It sounded a little like the 4th of July. Old Man Smith reached down and took her chin in his hands. "Oh, my Lord, what a beautiful face!" he said. "What a beautiful face! And you say she's lost her mind?" he said. "You say she's lost her mind?" He turned to Carol. "And what do you say?" he asked. "Oh, please, sir, Carol doesn't say anything," I explained. "He can't. He's dumb." "Dumb!" cried Old Man Smith. "So this is the dumb child, is it?" He looked at Carol. He looked at himself. He looked at my freckles. He rocked his hands on his stomach. "Merciful God," he said, "how are we all afflicted!" "Oh, please, sir," I said, "my brother Carol isn't afflicted at all. It's a great gift, my mother says, to be born with the gift of silence instead of the gift of speech." He made a little chuckle in his throat. He began to look at young Annie Halloway all over again. "And what does your mother say about her?" he pointed. "My mother says," I explained, "that she only hopes that the person who finds her mind will be honest enough to return it." "What?" said Old Man Smith. "To return it? Honest enough to return it?" He began to do everything all over again. To chuckle, to rock, to take young Annie Halloway's chin in his hand. "And what did you say your name was, my pretty darling?" he asked. Young Annie Halloway looked a little surprised. "My name is Robin," she said. "Dearest Robin, I think." "You think wrong," said Old Man Smith. He frowned with ferocity. It made us pretty nervous all of a sudden. Carol went off to look at the beehive to calm himself. Young Annie Halloway picked up the end of one of her long braids and looked at that. There was still about a foot of it that didn't have anything braided into it. I didn't know where to look, so I looked at the house. It was very glistening. Blue it glistened, and green it glistened, and red it glistened, and pink and purple and yellow. "Oh, see," I pointed. "There's old Mrs. Beckett's rose vase with the gold edge. She dropped it on the brick garden walk the day her son, who'd been lost at sea for 11 years, walked through the gate all alive and perfectly dry. And that chunky white nozzle with the blue stripe on it, I know what that is. It's the nose of Deacon Perry's first wife's best teapot. I've seen it there, in a glass cupboard on the top shelf. She never used it 'cept when the preacher came. The deacon's second wife broke it feeding the chickens out of it," said Old Man Smith. "And that little scrap of saucer," I cried, "with the pansy petal on it? Why, that's little Hallie Bent's doll dishes. We played with 'em down in the orchard. She died," I cried. "She had the whooping measles." "That little scrap of saucer," said Old Man Smith, "was the only thing they found in Mr. Bent's bank box. What the widow was looking for was gold." "And that green glass stopper!" I cried. "Oh, goody, goody, goody! Why, that—" "Hush your noise!" said Old Man Smith. "History is solemn. The whole history of the village is written on the outer walls of my house. When the sun strikes here, strikes there, on that bit of glass, on this bit of crockles, the edge of a plate, the rim of a tumbler. I read about folks' minds. What they loved, what they hated, what they was thinking of instead when it broke." He snatched his long white beard in his hands. He wagged his head at me. "There's a law about breaking things," he said. "Same as there's a law about losing 'em. My house is a sample book," he said. "On them there walls, all stuck up like that, I've got a sample of most every mind in the village. People give 'em to me themselves," he said. "They let me rake out their trash barrels every now and then. They don't know what they're givin'. Now that little pewter rosette there—" "It would be nice, wouldn't it," I said, "if you could find a sample of young Annie Halloway's mind? Then maybe you could match it." "Eh?" said Old Man Smith. "A sample of her mind?" He looked jerky. He growled in his throat. "Ahem! Ahem!" he said. He closed his eyes. I thought he'd decided to die. I screamed for Carol. He came running. He'd only been bee-stung twice. Old Man Smith opened his eyes. His voice sounded queer. "Where do they think she lost her mind?" he whispered. "In Europe," I said. "Maybe in a train. Maybe on a boat. They don't know. She can't remember anything about it." Said Old Man Smith. He looked at young Annie Halloway. "And where do you think you lost it?" he said. Young Annie Halloway seemed very much pleased to be asked. She laughed right out. "In a March wind," she said. "Eh?" said Old Man Smith. He turned to me again. "What did you say her name was?" he asked. I felt a little cross. "Halloway," I said. "Halloway, Halloway, Halloway. They live in the big house out by the chestnut trees. They only come here in the summers, except now. The doctors say it's Mysteria." "The doctors say what is Mysteria?" said Old Man Smith. "What Annie's got," I explained. "What made her lose her mind. Mysteria is what they call it." Said Old Man Smith. He reached way down into his pocket. He pulled out a box. He opened the box. It was full of pieces of colored glass and of china. He juggled them in his hands. They looked gay. Red they were, and green and white and yellow and blue. He snatched out all the blue ones and hid 'em quick in his pocket. "She seems sort of partial to blue," he said. There was one funny big piece of glass that was awful shiny. When he held it up to the light it glinted and glowed all sorts of colors. It made your eyes feel very calm. Annie Halloway reached out her hand for it. She didn't say a word. She just stared at it with her hand all reached out. But Old Man Smith didn't give it to her. He just sat and stared at her eyes. Her eyes never moved from the shining bit of glass. They looked awful funny. Bigger and bigger they got, and rounder, and stiller and stiller. It was like a puppy dog pointing a little bird in the grass. It made you feel queer. It made you feel all sort of hollow inside. It made your legs wobble. Carol's mouth was wide open. So was Old Man Smith's. Old Man Smith reached out suddenly and put the shining bit of glass right into Annie Halloway's hand. It fell through her fingers, but her hand stayed just where it was, reaching out into the air. "Put down your arm," said Old Man Smith. Annie Halloway put it down. Her eyes were still staring very wide. "Look," said Old Man Smith. "Look!" He dropped several pieces of colored glass china into her lap. She chose the handle of a red teacup and a little chunk of yellow crockery. She stared and stared at them, but all the time it was as though her eyes didn't see them. All the time it was as though she was looking at something very far away. Then all of a sudden she began to jingle them together in her hand, the little piece of red china and the chunk of yellow bowl, and swing her shoulders and stamp her foot. It looked like dancing. It sounded like clappers. "Oh ho! This is Spain!" she laughed. Old Man Smith snatched all the blue pieces of china and glass out of his pocket again and tossed them into her lap. He looked sort of mad. "Spain!" he said. "Spain? What in the old Harry has a handful of glass and china got to do with Spain?" "Harry?" said Annie Halloway. "Old Harry?" Her eyes looked wider and blinder every minute. It was as though everything in her was wide awake except the thing she was thinking about. "Harry?" she puzzled. "Harry?" She dropped the red and yellow china from her hand and picked up a piece of blue glass and offered it to Old Man Smith. "Why, that is Harry," she said. She reached for the pigtail that had the blue larkspur braided into it. She pointed to the pigtail that had the blue fan braided into it. "Why, that is Harry," she said. She made a little sob in her throat. Old Man Smith jingled his hands at her. "There, there, there, my pretty," he said. "Never mind, never mind." He opened his hands. There were some little teeny tiny pieces of plain glass in his hands. Little round knobs like beads they were, very shining. They made a nice jingle. When Annie Halliway saw them she screamed and snatched them in her hand and threw them away just as far as she could. All over the grass she threw them. "I will not!" she screamed. "I will not! I will not!" Her tears were awful. When she got through screaming her face looked like a wet cloth that had everything else wrung out of it except shadows. "Where is Harry?" said Old Man Smith. He said it very slowly, and then all over again. "Where is Harry? You wouldn't have darst not tell him if you'd known." Annie Halliway started to pick up some blue glass again. Then she stopped and looked all around her. It was a jerky stop. Her jaw sort of dropped. "Harry is in prison," she said. Even though she'd said it herself, she seemed to be awfully surprised at the news. She shook and shook her head as though she was trying to wake up the idea that was asleep. Her eyes were all scrunched up now with trying to remember about it. She dragged the back of her hands across her forehead. First one hand and then the other. She opened her eyes very wide again and looked at Old Man Smith. "Where is Harry?" said Old Man Smith. Annie Halliway never took her eyes from Old Man Smith's face. It was the night we crossed the border from France to Spain," she said. Her voice sounded very funny and far away. It sounded like reciting a lesson, too. "There were 7 of us and a teacher from the Paris Art School," she recited. It was the March holiday. There was a woman, a strange woman in the next compartment who made friends with me. She seemed to be crazy over my hair. She asked if she might braid it for the night." Without any tears at all, Annie Halliway began to sob again. "When they waked us up at the customs," she sobbed, "Harry came running. His face was awful. 'She's braided diamonds in your hair,' he cried. 'I heard her talking with her accomplice. $100,000 worth of diamonds. Smugglers and murderers both they are. Everybody will be searched.' He tore at my braids. I tore at my braids. The diamonds rattled out. Harry tried to catch them. He pushed me back into the train. I saw soldiers running. I thought they were going to shoot him. He thought they were going to shoot him. I saw his eyes. He looked so surprised. I'd never noticed before how blue his eyes were. I tell you, I saw his eyes. I couldn't speak. There wasn't anybody to explain just why he had his hands full of diamonds. I saw his eyes. I tell you. I couldn't speak. I tell you, I never spoke. My tongue went dead in my mouth. For months I never spoke. I've only just begun to speak again. I've only just." She started to jump up from the ground where she was sitting. She couldn't. She had braided Old Man Smith in his wheelchair into her hair. When she saw what she had done, she toppled right over on her face and fainted all out. Over behind the lilac bush somebody screamed. It was Annie Halliway's mother. With her was a strange gentleman who had come all the way from New York to try and cure Annie Halliway. The strange gentleman was some special kind of a doctor. "Hush, hush," the special doctor kept saying to everybody. "This is a very crucial moment. Can't you see that this is a very crucial moment?" He pointed to Annie Halliway on the grass. Her mother knelt beside her, trying very hard to comb Old Man Smith in his wheelchair out of her pigtail. "Speak to her," said the doctor. "Speak to her very gently." "Annie!" cried her mother. "Annie! Annie! Annie!" Annie Halliway opened her eyes very slowly and looked up. It was a brand new kind of look. It had a bottom to it instead of being just through and through and through. There was a little smile in it, too. It was a pretty look. "Why, Mother," said Annie Halliway, "where am I?" The special man from New York made a queer little sound in his throat. "Thank God," he said, "she's all right now." It seemed pretty quick to me. "You mean," I said, "that her mysteria is all cured now?" "Not mysteria," said the special man from New York. "Hysteria." "No, hersteria," corrected Old Man Smith. The special man from New York began to laugh. But Annie Halliway's mother began to cry. "Oh, just suppose we'd never found her!" she cried. She looked at Carol. She looked at me. She glared a little, but not so awfully much. "When you naughty children ran away with her," she cried, "and we couldn't find her anywhere, and the doctor came, and there was only an hour to spare, and we got a horse and drove round anywhere, and " "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," said the special man from New York. "And all your appointments waiting?" cried Annie Halliway's mother. "Darn the appointments," said the special man from New York. He slanted his head and looked at Old Man Smith. "We arrived," he said, "just at the moment when the young lady was gazing so intently at the piece of shiny glass." He made a funny grunt in his throat. "Let me congratulate you, Mr. Smith," he said. "Your treatment was most efficient. Your hypnosis was perfect. Your—" "Hip nothing," said Old Man Smith. "Of course, in a case like this," said the special man from New York, "the power of suggestion is always—" "All young folks," said Old Man Smith, "are cases of one kind or another. And the most powerful suggestion that I can make is that somebody find Harry." "Harry!" said Annie Halliway's mother. "Harry! Why, I've got 4 letters at home for Annie in my desk now, from some impetuous young man who signs himself Harry. He seems to be in an architect's office in Paris. Robin is what he calls Annie. Dearest Robin." "Eh?" said Annie Halliway. "What? Where?" She sat bolt upright. She scrambled to her feet. She started for the carriage. Her mother had to run to catch her. The special man from New York followed them just as fast as he could. Old Man Smith wheeled his chair to the gate to say good-bye. Everything seemed all mixed up. Annie Halliway's mother never stopped talking a single second. "Oh, my pet!" she cried. "My precious! My treasure!" With one foot on the carriage step, the special man from New York turned round and looked at Old Man Smith. He smiled a funny little smile. "Seek and ye shall find," he said. "That is, if you only know how and where to seek." Old Man Smith began to chuckle in his beard. "Yes, I admit that's quite a help," he said, "the knowing how and where. But before you set out seeking very hard for anything that's lost, it's a pretty good idea to find out first just exactly what it is that you're seeking for. When a young lady's lost her mind, for instance, that's one thing. But if it's her heart that's lost, why that, of course, is quite another." Annie Halliway's face wasn't white any more. It was as red as roses. She had it in her mother's shoulder. The horses began to prance. The carriage began to creak. Annie Halliway's mother looked all around. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, Mr. Smith," she said. "How shall I ever repay you?" Old Man Smith reached out his hand across the fence. There was sort of a twinkle in his eye. "$1, please," said Old Man Smith.